My name is Mabel Blake. I am 28 years old. And last Thanksgiving, my father looked down the length of his mahogany dining table, raised his wine glass in front of 20 corporate guests, and called me a disgrace for still renting an apartment. My sister Harper sat 2 seats away, polishing her engagement ring. She had just bought her 3rd house. My mother smiled and nodded, reaching for the butter. The table went silent. Every guest stopped eating, waiting for me to flush, to stammer, to shrink into my chair the way I always did. Instead, I unlocked my phone, pulled up a PDF of a legal deed, and set the screen face down next to his wine glass. When my father turned the phone over, the color left his face so fast he looked physically ill. His hand developed a fine tremor, making the device rattle against his gold wedding band. He stared at the screen, reading the same 3 lines of legal text over and over again. He did not know he was holding the title to the very house we were sitting in. He did not know his name was nowhere on it. Mine was. Before I tell you how my father ended up begging the daughter he publicly humiliated for a roof over his head, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Fluffy Revenge. Drop a comment below telling me your age, and if you have ever had a family member measure your worth by your bank account. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 2 years to the day the ledger in our family first stopped balancing. I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. In our neighborhood, a zip code operates like a resume, and square footage is treated as a moral virtue. My father, Richard, was a mid-level corporate executive who over-leveraged his entire life to look like he owned the building. My mother, Evelyn, spent her days ensuring the neighbors saw the least luxury cars and the expensive landscaping. Love in that house was an allocated resource, and all of it flowed in one direction. Harper was the golden child. She absorbed my father's social climbing ethos like a sponge. I was the overhead. I wore sensible clothes, fixed the wireless router, and observed. I am an actuary. I spend my days working in the loop, analyzing risk-calculating liabilities, and determining exactly when a fragile financial system will collapse. I do not deal in hope. I traffic in cold, unsentimental arithmetic, and I could see the cracks in my family's foundation long before the walls began to buckle. The first real fracture happened at a summer barbecue in our backyard. Harper had just closed on her 3rd investment property. My father was holding court near the grill, loudly bragging to the neighbors about his real estate mogul daughter. I was sitting quietly on the patio with a glass of water when he cornered me. He smelled of scotch and expensive cologne. He lowered his voice, dropping the performer act, and demanded a $15,000 loan. He called it a temporary cash flow issue. He promised a large return on investment. I looked at him. I had already analyzed the regional housing market data for my firm. I knew Harper's properties were financed on dangerous adjustable rate mortgages. I knew the math was underwater. I set my glass down and told him I needed to see his amortization schedules before I handed over a single dollar. My father stared at me. His face turned an ugly mottled red. He leaned in close, his voice thick with contempt, and told me I was a selfish, small-minded renter who would never understand how to build real wealth. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I just quietly refused the loan. I sat there in my sensible shoes and watched him walk back to his guests, playing the wealthy host on a patch of grass he could no longer afford. Walking away from that patio with my glass of water, I felt no guilt. I understood the exact mechanics of my family's financial ecosystem. To comprehend why my father demanded $15,000 from a daughter he despised, you have to understand the balance sheet of my childhood. In our household, affection was treated as a finite corporate asset. It required a high return on investment. My sister Harper provided that return. She was photogenic, loud, and shared my father's intense hunger for status. She mirrored his ethos perfectly. Harper was the golden child, the investment vehicle they poured all their emotional and financial capital into. I was the operational overhead. I was the quiet daughter who sat in the corner reading library books. I wore sensible clearance rack clothing while Harper wore designer labels purchased at full retail price. I was the child who untangled the cords behind the television, reset the wireless router when the network crashed, and organized the pantry so my mother could pretend she ran a highly efficient home. I did not rebel. I did not throw tantrums. I simply observed the stark contrast between what my parents projected to the world and what they actually possessed. The emotional erasure was systematic. When Harper graduated from high school, my parents rented a country club ballroom, hired a catering staff, and invited 50 people to celebrate her future. When I graduated at the top of my class 2 years later, earning a full academic scholarship that saved them tens of thousands of dollars, my father patted my shoulder in the kitchen and told me to make sure I kept my grades up so they would not have to pay my tuition. There was no party. There was no celebration. My achievement was simply categorized as a cost-saving measure on their monthly ledger. I did not cry over the lack of a cake. I retreated to my room and continued to calculate my own trajectory. We lived in an upscale community in the Illinois suburbs, a place defined by a distinct brand of pragmatic yet cutthroat corporate climbing. In towns like ours, success was not measured by character or quiet contentment. It was quantified by conspicuous consumption. My father held a respectable mid-level position at a logistics firm. On paper, he earned a salary that could have provided a very comfortable, secure life in a modest neighborhood. But comfort was not enough for Richard. He chased the executives above him, convinced that proximity to elite wealth would somehow make him truly wealthy. He and my mother overleveraged every aspect of their existence to maintain the illusion of high society. They leased 2 luxury SUVs, trading them in every 36 months for newer models to ensure the neighbors saw the fresh dealership plates in the driveway. They paid exorbitant annual dues to a local country club, charging overpriced dinners to a tab they could barely cover at the end of the month. Their most significant liability was the house itself. It was a sprawling McMansion with a faux stone facade, 5 bedrooms, and vaulted ceilings that cost a fortune to heat during the brutal Chicago winters. The property taxes alone in our county were staggering. The house was a physical manifestation of their financial anxiety. It commanded attention from the street, boasting a pristine lawn maintained by a costly landscaping service. But inside, the truth was evident to anyone paying attention. The grand chandelier in the foyer hung above scuffed hardwood floors they could not afford to refinish. The dual ovens in the gourmet kitchen sat unused while we ate cheap takeout because my mother was too exhausted from keeping up appearances to cook. They lived paycheck to paycheck, funding a millionaire aesthetic on high-interest credit lines. I recognized this discrepancy early. I remember being 14 years old, intercepting the mail and seeing the bright red final notice stamps on credit card statements my mother would quickly bury under glossy lifestyle magazines. I saw the quiet panic in my father's jaw when the property tax bill arrived. One evening during dinner, I made the mistake of pointing out a mathematical truth. My father was discussing financing a boat he wanted to keep at the lake. I calculated the compound interest in my head and gently noted that the monthly payments would exceed his disposable income, especially with Harper's private college tuition looming. My father slammed his fist on the dining table, rattling the silverware. He told me I lacked vision, that I was a pessimistic child who would never achieve greatness because I was too afraid to take risks. I learned then that data was an unwelcome guest in our home. That environment pushed me directly into actuarial science. In a house built entirely on optimistic projections and willful ignorance, I craved the cold, hard ground of statistical reality. An actuary does not care about your dreams or your ego. An actuary looks at mortality rates, assesses structural vulnerabilities, and determines the exact probability of ruin. It is a career built on stripping away the facade and seeing the skeleton underneath. I applied this professional lens to my own family long before I ever sat for my licensing exams. I knew they were uninsurable. Harper inherited my parents' specific defect, but she dressed it up as modern entrepreneurship. After college, she declared herself a real estate investor. She viewed property not as a place to live, but as a stepping stone to internet fame and unearned wealth. Within 3 years, she purchased 3 different properties around the Chicago metropolitan area. She bought a condo in Lincoln Park, a townhome in the western suburbs, and a duplex further south. She flaunted the keys on social media, posting lengthy captions about building passive income and securing generational wealth. My parents paraded her achievements at every social gathering. They pointed to Harper as the ultimate success story, the daughter who understood the value of equity. They used her growing portfolio as a weapon against me, constantly highlighting my decision to rent a modest apartment in the city as a failure of ambition. But I had pulled the public records on Harper's empire. I looked at the purchase prices, the property taxes, and the recorded deeds. Harper was building a skyscraper on a foundation of dry rot. She had purchased all 3 properties using risky adjustable-rate mortgages. She put down the bare minimum required to secure the loans, leaving her with virtually zero actual equity. Her entire business model relied on rental income covering her monthly payments. She willfully ignored the inevitable costs of maintenance reserves, vacancy periods, and rising property taxes. More dangerously, the low introductory interest rates on her loans were scheduled to expire. I mapped her cash flow on a spreadsheet in my quiet, affordable apartment. I ran the projections. Within 24 months, when those introductory rates adjusted upward to reflect the current market, her mortgage payments would skyrocket. The new payments would far exceed whatever rental income she could squeeze from her tenants. She would bleed cash every single month. It was not a remote possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Her real estate empire was a precarious house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. My father must have sensed the impending collapse. The $15,000 he demanded at the barbecue was not for a vague investment. He needed liquid capital to plug the holes in Harper's sinking ship. By refusing the loan, I did not just protect my own savings account. I drew a firm boundary. I refused to subsidize their shared delusion. I knew the crash was coming, and I was making sure I was not standing in the blast radius when the structure finally gave way. What I did not anticipate was that the fallout would require me to deploy a secret I had been guarding for years, a quiet inheritance that would change the power dynamic of my family forever. Harper stood near the edge of the kidney-shaped pool, holding a crystal flute of Prosecco, surrounded by a captive audience of aunts, uncles, and junior executives from my father's firm. She was loudly narrating her journey toward financial independence, wielding trendy buzzwords like passive income equity leverage and portfolio diversification as if she had invented them. My mother hovered nearby, a beaming sentinel ensuring everyone possessed a full glass, while casually steering every stray conversation back to her golden daughter's unparalleled success. I sat on a wrought iron patio chair in the deep shade of a maple tree sipping plain, iced tea. I wore a simple, unbranded linen dress, perfectly content to remain ignored. From my quiet vantage point, the entire gathering looked less like a joyous celebration and more like a desperate, sweaty attempt to manifest wealth through sheer volume and performative excess. In my profession, we are trained to ignore the sales pitch. We examine the underlying data to determine the structural integrity of a system. While Harper held court basking in the praise, I had discreetly accessed the county assessor database on my mobile phone. The information was entirely public, provided you knew the correct parcel numbers and understood how to navigate the municipal registry. I systematically reviewed the details of her newest acquisition, a narrow, poorly maintained townhome in a gentrifying western suburb. The numbers glaring back from my screen were disastrous. The purchase price was artificially inflated by an emotional bidding war she had refused to lose. The property taxes in that specific municipality had surged by a punishing 8% the previous year alone, a trend projected to continue. The homeowners association fees were exorbitantly high, yet the reserve study showed they barely collected enough to cover basic exterior maintenance, guaranteeing a hefty special assessment in the near future. But the most alarming variable was the precarious financing structure holding the entire deal together. Harper had utilized a 5-year adjustable rate mortgage. It offered a deceptively low initial monthly payment, masking the true cost of the debt with toxic clauses hidden deep within the fine print. Once the initial fixed period expired, the interest rate would recalibrate to the prime index plus a heavy margin. I pulled up the historical index charts and cross-referenced them with current economic forecasts. The central bank was already signaling steep rate hikes to combat inflation. I ran a rapid sensitivity analysis in my head. If the market rates increased by even 2 percentage points, her monthly debt obligation would eclipse the maximum rental yield that specific neighborhood could ever support. She would experience a severe negative cash flow situation almost immediately. Factoring in her other 2 heavily leveraged properties which were structured under similarly dangerous terms, the entire portfolio was a textbook default risk. She was not building a real estate empire. She was constructing a financial crater, and my parents were throwing a party to celebrate the excavation. My father broke my concentration. He separated himself from a group of impressed colleagues and ambled toward my isolated corner of the patio. He held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with expensive scotch and melting ice. His face was flushed from the brutal heat and the alcohol, but his eyes remained sharp, darting, and deeply calculating. He pulled up a chair next to mine, invading my quiet space with the heavy scent of designer cologne and roasted meat. He offered a wide, artificial smile that did not reach his eyes. He started with idle, transparent chatter, asking vague questions about my job in the city, nodding along without actually listening to a single word of my responses. I knew the script intimately. Richard never initiated a private conversation with me unless he needed an audience to perform for or a favor he intended to disguise as a gift. He leaned in close, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial hushed whisper. He framed his request as an exclusive time-sensitive opportunity. He claimed he had identified a short-term commercial flip, a highly lucrative project that required quick liquid capital to secure. He said he was generously allowing close family members to buy in before opening the venture to external corporate investors. The requested amount was exactly $15,000. He called it a bridge loan to cover a temporary cash flow hiccup. I looked at him. A temporary cash flow hiccup is the polite corporate term for insolvency. People with legitimate, lucrative investment opportunities do not corner their estranged daughters at a backyard barbecue to beg for a 5-figure sum. They go to a financial institution. I kept my facial expression entirely neutral. I did not accuse him of lying, nor did I point out the obvious desperation leaking through his confident facade. I simply engaged him using the cold, precise language of my profession. I told him I would be happy to review the proposal provided I could perform standard due diligence. I asked him to email me the property appraisal, the projected operating budget, and the trailing 12-month profit and loss statements. Most importantly, I requested to see the current amortization schedules for his existing liabilities and a verified debt-to-income ratio to understand his overall leverage position. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The artificial smile vanished, snapping off like a broken light bulb. The jovial patriarch facade crumbled away, revealing the panicked, angry man trapped underneath. The ice clinked sharply against his glass as his grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. He did not produce the requested documents. He produced pure venom. His voice rose, carrying a sharp, jagged edge that cut straight through the cheerful background music of the party. He leaned over me, his face turning a dark mottled red, a vein pulsing visibly near his temple. He called me an ungrateful, small-minded renter. He told me I lacked the visionary mindset required to succeed in the real world. He said I was too paralyzed by analytical fear to build actual wealth, destined to spend my miserable life counting other people's money while never accumulating any of my own. He pointed a shaking finger toward Harper, who was laughing loudly near the shallow end of the pool, and shouted that my sister possessed the courage to seize monumental opportunities while I cowardly hoarded pennies in a pathetic savings account. The patio grew uncomfortably quiet. A few guests glanced over their smiles, faltering before they quickly looked away, staring intensely at their plates to pretend they had not witnessed the verbal assault. I absorbed the tirade without a single flinch. In the field of risk management, emotional reactions are viewed as a critical vulnerability. You let the other party expose their panic while you secure your defensive position. His rage was not a display of authority. It was the desperate flailing of a man whose financial illusion was cracking under pressure. He needed my $15,000 to bail out Harper's sinking properties, and my demand for documentation meant he had to face the impending ruin alone. I stood up carefully, smoothing the front of my linen dress. I looked him directly in the eye, watching the bluster falter under a gaze that refused to break. I kept my voice perfectly steady, conversational, and chillingly polite. I informed him that without a verified amortization schedule and a clear risk profile, the investment was structurally unsound. I firmly declined the loan. Then I turned and walked away from the shaded patio, leaving him fuming in silence. That single defining interaction cemented my permanent status as the ultimate family disappointment. I officially became the selfish, calculating daughter who refused to support her own blood. But I did not care about their curated narrative. I cared about solvency. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the air-conditioned house, perfectly maintaining my boundaries while the heat suffocated everyone outside. I knew the storm was coming for them, bringing a tidal wave of debt they could not outswim. What Richard did not realize as he glared at my retreating back was that I did not need his harsh lectures on wealth building. I already held the keys to a quiet, unshakable fortune, a secret inheritance that would soon give me the ultimate power to save him or let him drown. My father believed prosperity was an outfit you put on every morning to impress people you secretly despised. His own father, Silas, understood that actual capital requires no audience. Grandpa Silas operated a moderately sized soybean and corn farm 3 hours south of the city. He drove a rusted domestic pickup truck, wore denim jackets frayed at the cuffs, and possessed hands that felt like cured leather. Richard viewed his father as a humiliating artifact of a blue-collar past he had spent his entire adult life trying to erase. We rarely visited the farm. Silas was almost never invited to the curated suburban dinner parties. But Silas possessed a particular clarity that bypassed my father's fragile ego and landed directly on me. During the rare holidays he did attend, he would sit in the corner of our vaulted living room sipping tap water, observing the performative chaos. He recognized the anxiety radiating from my parents. More importantly, he recognized the silent, calculating girl sitting on the stairs watching the family spend money they did not have. When I was 16, Silas drove up for a weekend and insisted on taking me to breakfast. We went to a dilapidated diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling vinyl booths and a perpetual smell of burnt coffee and harsh industrial bleach. He ordered black coffee and slid a manila folder across the sticky laminate table. Inside the folder was a ledger. It was not a farm operating budget. It was a comprehensive portfolio of low-cost index funds, municipal bonds, and undeveloped land parcels he had quietly accumulated over 4 decades. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. The bottom line represented a figure that would have made my father weep with envy. Silas tapped the page with a calloused index finger. He explained the fundamental mechanics of compound interest, the danger of depreciating assets, and the foolishness of borrowing money to purchase depreciating status symbols. He pointed to a specific line item reflecting a modest dividend yield. He told me that true freedom is silent. He said loud money is just debt wearing a tuxedo. That sticky diner table became my actual classroom. It was the exact moment I stopped feeling intimidated by my parents' aggressive consumption and started recognizing it as a terminal disease. Silas passed away during my senior year of college. The funeral was a brief, tense affair. My father wore a bespoke Italian suit to a rural graveside service, eager to finalize the probate process and claim what he assumed would be a lucrative inheritance to rescue his mounting credit card balances. He received nothing. Silas had structured his affairs with the same unsentimental precision he applied to crop rotation. He bypassed his son entirely. The farm was sold to a neighboring agricultural conglomerate, and the proceeds, along with the entire investment portfolio, were funneled directly into a blind trust. The legal documentation named me as the sole beneficiary. To protect me from my father's inevitable financial parasitism, Silas engineered the trust to remain opaque. My parents were informed only that the assets had been liquidated and absorbed by an anonymous corporate entity for charitable distribution. Richard spent 3 weeks pacing the hardwood floors of his McMansion, cursing the old man for squandering the family legacy. He never suspected the legacy was sitting across the kitchen island quietly eating cereal. I did not touch the capital for years. I allowed the investments to compound, managing the portfolio through a trusted fiduciary firm in the city. When I secured my position as an actuary, I earned a salary that easily supported my needs. The trust remained a dormant fortress shielding me from the financial panic that infected the rest of my bloodline. I chose to live in a modest, beautifully preserved vintage apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. It featured exposed brick walls, original crown molding, and a reliable radiator that hissed during the winter. I paid rent on the first of every month. I did not own the drywall. I did not own the plumbing. And that was precisely the point. My parents and my sister viewed my living situation as a personal failing. They weaponized the word renter, treating it as a synonym for immaturity. They believed that anchoring oneself to a heavy mortgage in a socially approved zip code was the only valid metric of adulthood. They did not understand the actuarial beauty of liquidity. If the roof of my building leaked, I did not face a sudden crippling repair bill. I simply submitted a maintenance request through an online portal. My capital was not trapped in a suburban foundation vulnerable to fluctuating property tax assessments, municipal zoning changes, or sudden neighborhood depreciation. My wealth was fluid, secure, and entirely within my control. I slept soundly every night, unburdened by the crushing leverage that kept my father awake, grinding his teeth. The trust was never meant to be a weapon. Silas intended it to be a shield, a mechanism to ensure I would never fall victim to the financial anxiety that defined the rest of my family. I planned to let it grow in the dark, perhaps using a fraction of the dividends to eventually fund a quiet retirement or support a cause I cared about. I never wanted to entangle my pristine ledger with my family's toxic liabilities. Holding that kind of quiet capital fundamentally changes the way you process insults. When Harper sneered at my practical sedan, or when Richard loudly bemoaned my lack of equity at holiday gatherings, their words bounced off a reinforced barrier. I absorbed their ridicule without reaction because I possessed the empirical data that disproved their entire worldview. A person holding a winning lottery ticket does not feel the need to argue with someone bragging about finding a quarter on the sidewalk. You simply let them talk. I maintained this strict boundary for 2 years after that tense summer barbecue. I kept my distance, attending only the mandatory family functions, observing Harper's real estate portfolio edge closer to the mathematical cliff I had predicted. I focused on my career analyzing corporate risk models and refining my own investment strategies. The separation provided a necessary breathable peace. I assumed their inevitable collapse would happen at a distance. I expected to receive a frantic phone call one afternoon begging for a bailout. I would politely decline. I was prepared to watch the facade crumble from the safety of my rented apartment, insulated by my grandfather's silent foresight. I figured they would eventually downsize, file for bankruptcy, and learn to live within their means. I underestimated the sheer velocity of their financial decay. The reality of their ruin did not arrive through a desperate phone call or a tearful confession in the living room. It arrived silently packaged as a routine data alert on my office computer, pulling me directly into the center of their wreckage. The fortress Silas built for me was about to face its first real test, forcing me to make a calculated decision that would alter the architecture of our family permanently. My office sits on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the Chicago Loop. The environment is engineered for total focus. We have sound-absorbing carpet ergonomic chairs and panoramic windows that overlook Lake Michigan. On a Tuesday morning in late October, the lake looked like a slab of gray iron. I sat at my desk running a localized risk assessment model for a new insurance product we were developing for the suburban housing market. The software aggregates municipal data tracking everything from shifting floodplains to microeconomic default trends in the collar counties. It is a powerful tool designed to highlight anomalies. I had the parameters set to flag properties in high-income zip codes entering pre-foreclosure status. My job was to isolate patterns of financial distress among affluent demographics. The algorithm generated a spreadsheet containing 47 flagged parcel numbers. I exported the data and began scanning the rows looking for statistical outliers. That is when a specific address caught my eye. The street name was familiar. The house number was etched into my memory. I blinked, adjusted my posture, and verified the county assessor records. The algorithm had not made a mistake. My parents were 120 days past due on their primary mortgage. I pulled up the detailed financial history of the property. The cold data painted a portrait of suffocating desperation. Richard had refinanced the house 3 times over the past decade, pulling out equity to fund the leased luxury vehicles and the country club dues. The most recent refinancing maneuver was a toxic financial instrument. He had secured a predatory interest-only loan with a catastrophic balloon payment scheduled for the end of a 5-year term. That 5-year term had expired 4 months ago. The bank demanded the principal balance in full. Richard did not have the capital. The lender had formally initiated the pre-foreclosure process, filing the initial public notices that precede a sheriff auction. I stared at the glowing monitor. My pulse remained steady. I did not feel a sudden surge of panic or the urge to weep. I felt the quiet, chilling clarity of a solved equation. The mystery of the $15,000 loan request from the summer barbecue was finally resolved. My father had not been trying to bail out Harper. He had been trying to cover a penalty fee to secure a temporary forbearance on his own collapsing mortgage. He was attempting to plug a sinking ship with spare change. If the bank proceeded with the foreclosure, the consequences would be catastrophic for their curated social image. The local court records would be published in the municipal paper. The neighbors would see the auction signs planted in the pristine front lawn. My parents would lose their home, their status, and their primary source of identity. More importantly, an eviction would create a severe logistical liability for me. A bankrupt Richard and Evelyn would inevitably turn to their children for shelter. Harper was already drowning in her own toxic real estate debt. She could not house them. The burden of providing a roof would fall entirely on the daughter who rented the practical apartment in the city. They would arrive at my door with their designer luggage and their endless entitlement, infecting my carefully protected sanctuary with their financial disease. I could not allow that to happen, but I also could not write them a personal check. Handing liquid capital to my father was the equivalent of pouring gasoline on a grease fire. He would use the funds to maintain his country club membership, or lease a newer vehicle convinced he had outsmarted the system once again. He would learn nothing. He would remain arrogant, reckless, and hungry for more. Risk management dictates that you mitigate the damage without increasing your own exposure. I needed to keep a roof over their heads while permanently removing their ability to leverage the property. During my lunch hour, I walked 3 blocks to the office of the fiduciary, who managed my grandfather Silas and his blind trust. I sat in a leather chair and outlined a highly specific corporate acquisition strategy. We formed an anonymous limited liability company registered in Delaware. I named it Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. Through this faceless corporate entity, my lawyer contacted the originating lender holding my parents' toxic mortgage. Banks despise carrying distressed residential debt on their books. It requires expensive legal proceedings and unpredictable auction outcomes. Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners offered to purchase the distressed note directly from the bank at a slight discount, providing them with immediate liquidity and a clean balance sheet. The bank accepted the offer within 48 hours. Once my LLC owned the debt, my lawyer drafted a deed in lieu of foreclosure agreement and presented it to Richard. The terms were brutally simple. Richard and Evelyn would sign the title of the house over to Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. In exchange, the LLC would forgive the outstanding balloon payment and halt all public foreclosure proceedings. Furthermore, the LLC would allow them to remain in the property by converting their occupancy into a standard residential lease. They would become tenants in the house they once owned. My lawyer informed me that Richard signed the paperwork with eager, trembling hands. My father believed he had successfully executed a brilliant corporate negotiation. He thought a private equity firm had recognized the inherent value of his property and offered him a lucrative sale-leaseback arrangement. He managed to avoid the public humiliation of a foreclosure auction, keeping his carefully curated suburban facade intact. The neighbors would never know the deed had changed hands. I reviewed the signed lease agreement in my apartment. I set the monthly rent at a subsidized rate. It was high enough to cover the property taxes and the maintenance reserves, but significantly lower than the actual market value of a 5-bedroom estate in that zip code. I was not looking to extract a profit from my parents. I was simply containing a hazardous liability. I was now their legal landlord. I owned the faux stone facade. I owned the vaulted ceilings. I owned the hardwood floors they could not afford to refinish. The irony was sharp and deeply satisfying. The man who dedicated his life to mocking my lack of equity was now entirely dependent on my silent grace to avoid homelessness. He would continue to brag about his sprawling estate at networking events, oblivious to the fact that his tenure in the neighborhood relied upon a monthly electronic transfer to a bank account I controlled. I filed the executed deed in a fireproof safe in my closet. I did not celebrate. I went back to work the next morning, processing claims and analyzing mortality tables. I maintained my usual distance, waiting for the inevitable moment when my father would test the boundaries of his new arrangement. I knew it was only a matter of time before the arrogant homeowner clashed with the strict regulations of a corporate lease. I just needed to remain patient. The holiday season was rapidly approaching, and my parents had already sent the formal invitations for our annual family gathering. They were hosting Thanksgiving at the house. My house. The crisp air of late November in the Midwest carries a distinct biting chill that strips the leaves from the oak trees and forces everyone indoors. I parked my practical sedan at the very end of the long concrete driveway, ensuring I did not block the pristine luxury vehicles leased by my family. Walking up the stamped concrete path toward the faux stone portico, I noted a hairline fracture developing in the masonry near the lower foundation. A property owner registers structural defects instantly. A holiday guest merely admires the elaborate seasonal wreath hanging on the front door. On this particular Thursday, I was required to play the role of the guest in a house I legally possessed. I stepped through this entryway into a wall of overwhelming aromas. The house smelled of roasted sage cinnamon and the familiar sharp scent of performative joy. My mother, Evelyn, darted between the kitchen island and the formal dining room, anxiously straightening linen napkins and adjusting the placement of the crystal wine glasses. She wore an eager, frantic expression, desperate to orchestrate a flawless holiday gathering that would reaffirm her elevated status in the neighborhood. My sister Harper sat perched on a velvet bar stool, swirling a glass of sparkling cider. She had positioned her newest acquisition in the direct center of the granite counter, displaying it like a rare museum artifact. It was a quilted leather designer handbag with gleaming gold hardware, a limited seasonal release that retailed for a figure roughly equivalent to a standard mortgage payment. Harper stroked the soft leather, bragging to our visiting aunt about the exclusive waiting list required to purchase it. I poured myself a glass of tap water and listened to the hollow pitch. My actuarial training makes it impossible to view luxury goods without calculating their immediate depreciation curve. I knew Harper was funding this aesthetic on credit cards carrying punishing interest rates. Her real estate portfolio was hemorrhaging cash, yet she continued to swipe her plastic, insulating herself in expensive leather while her net worth plunged into negative territory. We eventually migrated to the formal dining room. My father, Richard, took his customary position at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore a tailored sweater and a gold watch, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch providing a lavish feast for his dependents. He picked up the carving knife and began slicing the turkey, which was notoriously dry every single year. As he distributed the meat, he launched into a fiery monologue about his new corporate landlord. He believed a faceless private equity firm called Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners had purchased his distressed debt as a strategic investment. He had zero suspicion that the sole managing member of that entity was sitting 3 feet away, quietly chewing a piece of celery. Richard stabbed a slice of turkey with his serving fork, his face flushed with indignation. He complained bitterly about the sheer incompetence of the property management portal. 2 weeks prior, he had submitted an aggressive maintenance request. He demanded the installation of a state-of-the-art climate control system, claiming the luxury upgrade would significantly increase the asset value for the owner. The existing furnace in the basement was only 6 years old. I had reviewed the inspection reports during the deed transfer. The unit functioned flawlessly and met all municipal heating codes. Through my attorney, I had issued a standard sterile denial letter explaining that the management company does not approve cosmetic upgrades to functional mechanical systems. My father was furious at the rejection. He viewed the denial as a personal insult from a bureaucratic bean counter who failed to recognize his superior real estate acumen. He chewed his food loudly, gesturing with his wine glass. He called the anonymous landlord a short-sighted idiot who lacked the vision to maximize a premium suburban property. He promised the table he would eventually force the management company to bend to his will, boasting about his formidable negotiation skills. I sat in my chair, sipping a modest glass of red wine. I focused on the faint, steady hum of the perfectly functional furnace vibrating through the floorboards. I maintained a neutral, pleasant expression. I did not offer any legal advice. I did not defend the fictional property manager. I simply listened to the man I rescued from eviction complain about the quality of his rescue. Richard, sensing a lack of enthusiastic agreement from my side of the table, shifted his frustration toward a familiar, reliable target. He needed to reassert his dominance, and my quiet presence always provided the perfect foil for his ego. He looked pointedly at my sensible scuff-resistant leather shoes and the unbranded wool sweater I had worn to dinner. He steered the conversation away from his landlord and focused a spotlight on my perceived failures. He loudly lamented my lack of ambition. He told the extended relatives at the table that I was stagnant, wasting my potential in a dead-end corporate cubicle. While Harper was out conquering the residential market, Evelyn immediately chimed in, passing a bowl of mashed potatoes. She offered a sigh of theatrical pity. She stated that it physically pained her to watch me throw a substantial portion of my income into a black hole every month. She declared that renting an apartment was a tragic waste of capital, a permanent roadblock on the path to true adulthood. She urged me to ask Harper for advice on securing a starter home, suggesting I might eventually learn how to build real equity if I stopped being so stubborn. I looked around the dining table. I observed Harper drowning in toxic debt, clutching a purse she did not truly own. I observed my mother exhausted from maintaining a social facade that required her to lie to her friends. I observed my father spewing arrogant financial advice inside a structure where he possessed zero legal rights. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. I nodded slowly, offering a polite, non-committal hum of acknowledgement. I thanked Evelyn for the advice and took another sip of wine. The psychological toll of holding a secret of this magnitude is difficult to articulate. It does not feel like a triumphant victory. It feels like carrying a heavy loaded weapon in your coat pocket during a crowded party. You are hyper-aware of the weight with every single step you take. You know you possess the power to end the entire charade in a fraction of a second. But you also know the blast radius will leave a permanent crater in your own life. Being the only solvent adult in a family of performing children is an isolating, exhausting burden. I did not want to be their landlord. I did not want to monitor their lease compliance or review their maintenance demands. I simply wanted a father who asked about my day and a mother who did not view my stability as a personal affront. Instead, I had to act as a silent warden, protecting them from the consequences of their own vanity, while they mocked me for wearing the uniform of a prison guard. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever sat in a crowded room listening to people belittle your choices, knowing you hold a single piece of paper that could level the entire building? Have you ever chosen to swallow your pride and let them insult you, simply because the truth would break them beyond repair. If you understand that specific suffocating silence, tell me your story in the comments. I survived that Thanksgiving dinner by compartmentalizing the insult. I helped clear the plates, washed the good crystal by hand, and drove back to my peaceful rented apartment in the city. I assumed the holiday tension would dissipate, returning our dynamic to a simmer. I underestimated my father's bruised ego, denied his luxury HVAC system by a faceless corporation. Richard decided he was no longer going to play by the rules of the lease. He was about to test the boundaries of his anonymous landlord, initiating an administrative war that would require me to strip away every ounce of daughterly affection I had left. The winter thawed into a damp, gray Illinois spring, and with the melting snow came the resurgence of my father's bruised ego. Denied his state-of-the-art climate control system, Richard decided to test the structural integrity of his lease agreement. He began treating the anonymous property management portal not as a legal conduit between tenant and landlord, but as his personal suburban concierge service. In the affluent enclaves of the Chicago metropolitan area, spring brings a vicious, unspoken competition. Curb appeal is the ultimate metric of neighborhood dominance. As the ground-softened landscaping trucks swarmed the streets, deploying armies of workers to lay fresh mulch and plant immaculate rows of seasonal flowers. Richard, acutely aware of his neighbors watching, felt the intense pressure to project overwhelming financial health. He logged into the tenant portal and submitted a massive multi-tiered landscaping demand. He did not request routine lawn maintenance. He demanded the installation of 12 mature arborvitae trees to create a privacy screen along the property line. He requested the demolition of the existing concrete walkway and the construction of a custom bluestone path. He included a hyperlink to a high-end horticultural supply company, insisting on a specific variety of imported Japanese maple for the front garden bed. He phrased the submission not as a request, but as an operational directive, stating that these upgrades were absolutely critical to maintaining the prestige of the asset. I sat at my desk in the loop, reading his demand on my monitor. The sheer audacity of the submission was breathtaking. He was a tenant occupying a 5-bedroom estate at a 40% discount, yet he felt entirely entitled to dictate capital improvements to the entity that had rescued him from a sheriff auction. I did not reply directly. I forwarded the request to the attorney managing Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. We drafted a response rooted in pure, unyielding contract law. I treated my father exactly as he treated the world. I reduced him to a liability on a spreadsheet. The email my lawyer sent back was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. It cited Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the standard residential lease agreement he had signed. It reminded him that the tenant was solely responsible for basic yard upkeep, and that all structural or permanent landscaping alterations were strictly prohibited without prior written authorization. The final sentence was definitive. The request for capital landscaping improvements is denied. Richard did not handle the rejection with grace. He retaliated using the only tactic he understood. He attempted to exert financial leverage. He submitted a hostile message through the portal threatening to withhold his next monthly rent payment until the management company agreed to negotiate the landscaping upgrades. He argued that the exterior of the home was becoming a blight on the neighborhood, completely ignoring the fact that a true blight would have been a bank foreclosure sign hammered into the front lawn. He claimed he was placing the rent in an escrow account, a bluff I knew was factually impossible because his personal bank accounts were running on fumes. My attorney advised me to issue a formal cure or quit notice, the standard legal response to a threat of non-payment. I authorized the document. We informed him that any failure to remit the exact rental amount on the first of the month would result in immediate eviction proceedings accompanied by a lawsuit for breach of contract. We reminded him that the lease contained no provisions for tenant-mandated capital improvements, and that withholding rent was a direct violation of Illinois state housing law. The legal warning cornered him, but it also enraged him. Stripped of his leverage, Richard decided to bypass the digital portal and escalate the conflict verbally. He found the administrative phone number for the property management firm associated with my LLC. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, my lawyer sent me an encrypted audio file. He explained that a tenant had called the front desk, bypassed the receptionist, and managed to corner a junior property manager on a recorded line. The lawyer suggested I listen to the exchange to understand the escalating hostility of the occupant. I sat in my quiet vintage apartment in Lincoln Park. I brewed a cup of dark roast coffee, sat down at my kitchen island, and pressed play on my laptop. The audio quality was perfectly clear. I heard the sharp, arrogant bark of my father's voice echoing through the small speakers. He did not introduce himself politely. He launched into an immediate, aggressive tirade. He demanded to speak to the senior partners of the investment firm. He berated the junior manager, a young man who was simply trying to explain standard operating procedures. Richard called the employee a glorified paper pusher. He demanded to know the educational background of the person refusing his landscaping request, mocking the young man's polite, steady tone. He used phrases designed to belittle and shrink the person on the other end of the line. He asked if the company understood the caliber of resident they were dealing with, boasting about his corporate title and his vast experience managing multi-million-dollar logistics contracts. I sat perfectly still, listening to the recording loop a second time. My coffee grew cold in the mug. For 28 years, I had watched my father perform this exact routine. I had watched him demean waitstaff at country club dinners, belittle mechanics who repaired his least luxury vehicles, and verbally abuse my mother when a household chore was executed poorly. I had spent my entire childhood absorbing the collateral damage of his fragile, monstrous ego. But hearing it now, captured on a sterile digital recording directed at a complete stranger who was simply enforcing a contract I had written, shifted something fundamental inside my chest. The last lingering fragments of daughterly guilt evaporated. The small, quiet voice in the back of my mind that occasionally wondered if my secret landlord arrangement was too cruel was permanently silenced. My father was not a victim of a harsh economy. He was not a struggling patriarch doing his best to provide for his family. He was a tyrant. He was a man who believed the rules of society, the constraints of mathematics, and the basic tenets of human decency did not apply to him. He operated under the delusion that his sheer arrogance could bend reality to his will. The emotional erasure I had experienced my entire life was not a mistake. It was a calculated feature of his personality. He viewed anyone who did not immediately submit to his demands as an enemy to be crushed. He was currently trying to crush the very entity that was keeping a roof over his head. My emotional detachment hardened into cold actuarial certainty. A liability this volatile could not be reasoned with. It could only be managed, contained, and eventually allowed to self-destruct. I closed the audio file and deleted it from my desktop. I sent a brief one-line email to my attorney. I instructed him to enforce every single clause of the lease agreement with zero tolerance. There would be no grace periods for late payments. There would be no warnings for minor infractions. Richard paid his rent on the first of the month, terrified by the looming threat of eviction. He abandoned his demands for the imported Japanese maples and the bluestone walkway. The front yard remained exactly as it was, an ordinary suburban lawn that failed to reflect the magnificent wealth he pretended to possess. He had lost the administrative war with the property management portal. But a man like my father cannot tolerate a loss. If he could not bully the anonymous landlord into upgrading his stage, he would simply bypass the landlord entirely. He would take the matter into his own hands, funding his vanity through illegal modifications and toxic personal debt. He was about to make a decision involving his kitchen that would violate the core foundations of his lease and set the stage for his ultimate spectacular ruin. The Illinois summer arrived with a heavy, stagnant humidity that mirrored the escalating pressure inside my family's social circle. The logistics firm my father worked for thrived on perpetual corporate restructuring. He survived a recent merger not by producing exceptional results, but by expertly navigating the political currents of middle management. In July, they awarded him a new title. He was named Senior Director of Regional Operations. It was a lateral transfer wrapped in prestigious phrasing. The salary bump barely covered inflation, but Richard treated the updated business cards like a royal decree. He immediately decided that he must host an inaugural dinner party to welcome the new executive vice presidents. He envisioned an exclusive networking event that would cement his status among the upper echelon of the firm. There was only one problem. The stage was not up to his exacting standards. The kitchen in that 5-bedroom home was entirely functional. It featured stainless steel appliances, solid countertops, and plenty of space for a family that ordered takeout 4 nights a week. But the finishes were 15 years old. To a man obsessed with optics, 15-year-old cabinetry was a catastrophic social failing. He needed a culinary showpiece. He needed a sprawling quartz island, a commercial-grade range, and custom millwork to prove to his new bosses that he belonged in their tax bracket. He logged into the property management portal and submitted his most audacious proposal yet. He outlined a $60,000 renovation plan. He did not ask for permission. He presented the project as a mutually beneficial investment opportunity. He argued that upgrading the kitchen would dramatically increase the overall asset value for the silent ownership group. He offered to oversee the construction management for free, framing his labor as a generous favor to the faceless corporate landlord. I sat in my downtown office staring at the itemized budget he had attached to the digital request. He wanted imported Italian marble. He wanted smart home lighting integration. He wanted a wine refrigerator capable of holding 200 bottles. I applied the standard actuarial lens to his proposal. The return on investment for high-end kitchen remodels is notoriously poor. More importantly, I had no desire to increase the speculative value of a property I was simply holding to contain a liability. I forwarded the request to my legal counsel with a single instruction. We needed to issue a hard denial. The response we sent was devoid of emotion. It referenced the specific addendums in his residential lease that strictly prohibited structural modifications, electrical alterations, and plumbing relocations. We informed him that the current kitchen met all habitability standards and that Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners was not entertaining capital improvements. A rational tenant receiving that legal notice would have canceled the caterer or moved the dinner to a rented restaurant space. My father was not a rational tenant. His ego was a ravenous entity that demanded constant feeding regardless of the financial cost. He could not tolerate the idea of hosting elite executives in a dated kitchen. He needed the marble. He needed the prestige. He decided the rules of the lease did not apply to him. 3 weeks later, an automated alert arrived in my email inbox. When you legally own a parcel of real estate, you can register for municipal notifications regarding building permits. I received a digital ping indicating that a licensed plumbing contractor and a structural electrician had filed permits for my exact address. Richard had bypassed the denial. He was proceeding with the $60,000 renovation anyway. I pulled his recent credit profile using a standard soft inquiry, authorized through the lease agreement. The data painted a terrifying picture. Because his debt-to-income ratio was already stretched beyond its breaking point, traditional banks had denied his home improvement loan applications. To fund his vanity project, he had secured an unsecured personal loan from a predatory alternative lender. The interest rate bordered on extortion. He was financing custom cabinetry with debt so expensive it practically guaranteed his insolvency. He likely justified the risk by convincing himself that his new job title would yield a substantial year-end bonus, allowing him to wipe out the principal before the interest devoured his paycheck. It was a textbook gambler's fallacy. My initial instinct as a property owner was to dispatch my attorney, issue a cease and desist order, and halt the unauthorized construction immediately. But the cold, calculating discipline of my profession took over. If I stopped him now, he would play the victim. He would claim the landlord was unreasonable. He would find a way to twist the narrative, painting himself as a visionary stifled by bureaucratic red tape. Instead, I chose to let him proceed. I chose to let him dig a hole so deep the walls would eventually collapse in on him. The following Tuesday, I took an extended lunch break. I drove my practical sedan out to the suburbs. I did not park in the driveway. I parked down the street, obscured by the shade of a large oak tree. My lease agreement included a standard clause permitting the management company to conduct routine exterior inspections of the premises. I sat in the driver's seat and documented the scene. A large industrial roll-off dumpster sat on the pristine concrete driveway, filled with the shattered remains of the original granite countertops and the old cabinetry. 3 commercial contractor vans were parked along the curb. I heard the high-pitched whine of a power saw cutting through drywall. A cloud of white dust drifted out the open front door. I watched a crew of laborers carry heavy sheets of drywall and boxes of expensive tile across the threshold. I rolled down my window and took crisp date-stamped photographs using a high-resolution camera. I captured the license plates of the contractor vehicles. I photographed the bright orange building permit taped to the front window. I gathered undeniable forensic evidence of a catastrophic lease violation. Watching the workers carry materials into my home, I felt a chilling sense of clarity. My father was constructing a monument to his own vanity on soil he did not own. He was permanently altering the structural integrity of a house he merely occupied, funding the destruction with toxic debt he could never repay. He was committing the ultimate act of financial treason against the silent daughter holding his fate. He believed he was outsmarting a faceless corporation. He thought he could act with impunity, insulated by his new job title and his arrogant assumptions. He was preparing to host a networking dinner to celebrate an illusion, inviting powerful people to admire a lifestyle that was technically stolen. I put the camera away, shifted my car into drive, and steered back toward the city. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the steady, methodical patience of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. The documentation was safely secured in a digital vault. I would let him finish his beautiful, unauthorized kitchen. I would let him host his crucial dinner party. I would let the paint dry and the imported marble set. Because the heavier the investment he made in that illusion, the more devastating it would be when I finally presented him with the bill. And just as his unauthorized construction project neared completion, the fragile financial ecosystem supporting the rest of my family experienced a seismic shock. My sister Harper was about to learn that mathematics do not care about your social media following, forcing my father to make a desperate demand that would light the final fuse. The central bank adjusted its baseline interest rates early that September, sending a ripple through the financial markets that felt like a quiet, localized earthquake. For individuals holding fixed-rate mortgages and diversified retirement portfolios, the policy change registered as a minor headline on the morning news broadcast. For those balancing their net worth on adjustable-rate debt, the adjustment was a death sentence. I sat in my downtown office watching the yield curves shift on my dual monitors, knowing precisely what the incoming data meant for the golden child of our family. 2 years prior, sitting in the shade of that cedar pergola during their backyard barbecue, I had calculated the exact timeline of my sister's inevitable ruin. The mathematics were finally collecting their due. Harper's introductory loan periods expired simultaneously across all 3 of her investment properties. The new interest rates reset to reflect the hardened market conditions, driving her monthly debt obligations through the roof in a matter of weeks. Her rental income, already stretched thin by rising property taxes and unexpected maintenance fees she had never bothered to hold reserves for, fell woefully short. Her tenants could not absorb the steep rent hikes required to cover the new mortgage premiums. One unit sat vacant for 2 months after a renter broke their lease and moved out in the middle of the night. That single deficit triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. She tried to secure refinancing, hoping to lock in a stabilized fixed rate to stop the bleeding, but the bank appraisals revealed the grim truth. The localized housing market had cooled, wiping out whatever imaginary equity she believed she possessed. The underwriters viewed her portfolio as a toxic liability. They rejected her applications out of hand. Within 60 days, Harper spiraled from a self-proclaimed real estate mogul, posting motivational success quotes on social media, to a delinquent borrower fielding relentless calls from debt collectors. She was staring down the barrel of imminent, undeniable bankruptcy. The illusion of her success fractured, sending our parents into a state of frantic, disorganized panic. They could not rescue her using their own capital. My father was secretly drowning in the exorbitant high-interest personal loan he had taken out to fund his unauthorized kitchen renovation. His credit score was battered, his debt-to-income ratio a crimson flag to any reputable underwriter in the state of Illinois. He had backed himself into a corner to impress his new executives, leaving him powerless to assist his favored daughter. The burden of salvation, therefore, shifted to the only solvent relative left on the board. My phone rang on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing actuarial tables at my kitchen island. I recognized his number flashing on the screen. I answered, expecting the usual brief transactional holiday logistics. Instead, I received an operational directive. Richard did not ask for a favor. He delivered a mandate. He explained Harper's predicament using sanitized corporate jargon, framing her impending bankruptcy as a minor liquidity crunch caused by unpredictable macroeconomic headwinds. He told me they had located a specialty lender willing to issue a substantial consolidation loan that would restructure her debt and save the properties. There was just one administrative hurdle. The lender required a co-signer with a pristine credit history and a verifiable unencumbered salary. He informed me that I would be providing my signature on the underwriting documents by the end of the week. He framed it as a familial obligation, a rare opportunity for me to finally contribute something meaningful to the legacy he and Harper were trying to build. I listened to the pitch, letting the silence stretch across the line. I pictured the ledger. A consolidation loan for a borrower with zero equity and negative cash flow is not a financial recovery strategy. It is a slow, agonizing execution. By attaching my signature to that document, I would become legally responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars of toxic debt the moment she inevitably defaulted again. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from my response. I informed him that I would not co-sign the documents. I broke down the reality of Harper's situation using the stark, unyielding vocabulary of my profession. I pointed out that her debt service coverage ratio was fundamentally broken. I explained that she was not experiencing a temporary liquidity crunch. She was structurally insolvent. A new loan would merely prolong the inevitable foreclosure, while dragging my own financial stability into the abyss alongside hers. I advised them to let the properties go file for bankruptcy protection and rebuild from a place of reality rather than delusion. The line went dead quiet. Then the veneer cracked. My father unleashed a torrent of vicious, unfiltered hostility. He accused me of enjoying my sister's downfall. He called me a jealous, bitter spinster who spent her life hoarding pennies because she was too terrified to actually live. He yelled until his voice went hoarse, eventually slamming the phone down and severing the connection. I set my device on this counter, feeling the familiar hollow ache of being the family scapegoat. That brief sting was quickly replaced by the cold armor of my discipline. I had anticipated the anger, but I had underestimated his vindictiveness. The following morning, an email arrived in my personal inbox. Richard had drafted it late at night, letting his bruised ego dictate the keystrokes. It was a blistering, venomous message. He stated that my refusal to save my own blood was a betrayal he would never forgive. He called me a parasite who merely existed in the shadows, contributing nothing of value to the family name, while judging those who dared to reach for greatness. He painted himself as a martyr fighting for his family and me as a stone-hearted bystander plotting their demise. The final paragraph contained his ultimate leverage, or at least what he perceived to be his leverage. He referenced the upcoming networking dinner, the elaborate event he was hosting that weekend, to showcase his new executive title and his freshly remodeled unauthorized kitchen. He wrote that my presence would be a dark cloud over an otherwise triumphant evening. He explicitly stated that I was uninvited from the gathering. I was forbidden from setting foot in his home unless I arrived carrying a checkbook and a signed commitment to underwrite Harper's consolidation loan. He thought he was banishing me. He believed the threat of social exclusion from his prestigious circle would force me to capitulate. He had no idea that the home he was banishing me from was legally mine. He had no idea that the custom cabinetry and the imported marble he intended to show off to his colleagues were installed in direct violation of a lease agreement I controlled. The intersection of Harper's financial ruin and his unauthorized construction project created a highly unstable compound. He had lit the fuse himself, operating under the assumption that I was a powerless renter desperate for his approval. I read the email 3 times, analyzing every toxic word. I did not draft a lengthy defense. I did not attempt to justify my financial boundaries or plead for my seat at the table. I simply opened a blank reply window. I typed a single definitive line. I will be at the dinner. I will bring exactly what you have earned. I clicked send, locked my computer, and began preparing for the weekend. The ledger was finally ready to be closed. Saturday evening arrived with an unseasonably warm breeze, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and cut grass from the interstate. I parked my practical sedan 3 blocks away from the property to avoid the valet service Richard had hired for a residential dinner party. Walking up the manicured sidewalk, I noted the overflow of expensive European vehicles lining both sides of the street. The luxury cars formed a physical manifestation of high leverage. I wore a tailored charcoal sheath dress and plain black pumps. My outfit was designed to project competence rather than wealth. I stepped through the heavy mahogany front door and entered the epicenter of my father's financial treason. The entryway smelled of imported lilies, expensive perfume, and underneath it all the sharp chemical odor of fresh latex paint and new polyurethane. It was the distinct scent of unauthorized construction. The foyer was crowded with people holding crystal flutes. Rented floral centerpieces dominated the entryway table, their vibrant colors attempting to mask the quiet desperation humming beneath the floorboards. Hired waitstaff navigated the throng, offering small, delicate appetizers on silver trays. Richard had spared no expense to fund this charade. He was pulling from credit lines that were already bleeding him dry. I moved through the foyer toward the rear of the house, letting the ambient noise of corporate networking wash over me. The new kitchen was a monument to fiscal irresponsibility. The walls separating the dining room had been removed, replaced by a sprawling open-concept design anchored by an oversized island topped with imported white marble. Custom white cabinetry reached the ceiling, illuminated by recessed smart lighting. A commercial-grade stainless steel range sat against the far wall. That culinary engine would likely only ever boil water for pasta. It was a beautiful magazine-ready space. It was also a blatant $60,000 violation of paragraph 8 in the standard residential lease agreement, sitting in my fireproof safe. I scanned the room, categorizing the attendees. There were regional directors from my father's logistics firm, local municipal politicians seeking campaign contributions, and a smattering of suburban social climbers eager to associate with perceived wealth. In the corner near the new wine refrigerator, I spotted my sister Harper. The golden child gripped a glass of Pinot Noir with white knuckles. Her smile was brittle, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. The impending collapse of her real estate portfolio was taking a physical toll. She wore a designer silk blouse projecting success while her checking account careened toward a zero balance. In our family, when the pressure mounted, the performance simply became louder. My mother, Evelyn, hovered near Harper, acting as a social shield. She expertly intercepted guests, steering conversations away from market trends and directing them toward superficial compliments about the catering. Evelyn spent her entire adult life managing the optics of our family, ensuring no outsider ever saw the cracks in the foundation. She wore a rigid smile, determined to ignore the fact that her eldest daughter was facing imminent bankruptcy, and her husband was funding a dinner party on predatory debt. My father stood near the center of the marble island, surrounded by 3 executives wearing tailored navy suits. Richard held a glass of bourbon, gesturing expansively as he detailed the sheer effort required to oversee such an elaborate home renovation. He took full credit for the structural upgrades, weaving a fictional narrative about his keen eye for interior design and his commitment to increasing property value. he spotted me standing near the perimeter of the kitchen. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had explicitly banned me from this gathering unless I arrived willing to underwrite Harper's consolidation loan. My presence was a direct challenge to his authority. Instead of causing a scene or pulling me aside, Richard chose a different tactic. He decided to neutralize the threat by turning me into a prop for his audience. He beckoned me over with a wave of his hand, projecting a booming, jovial tone. He draped an arm around my shoulder. The gesture felt like a heavy, unwelcome weight. He turned to the executives, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. He introduced me using the exact same tone one might use to introduce a disappointing pet. He told his colleagues my name and noted that I worked a quiet desk job in the city. Then he delivered the punchline. "This is Mabel," Richard said, flashing a wide artificial grin. "She is our renter. She is still trying to figure out how basic mortgages work while her sister builds an empire." The executives chuckled. It was an uncomfortable, polite laughter, the kind produced by subordinates unwilling to offend a host. They glanced at my sensible dress, their eyes tracing the distinct lack of luxury brands, and quickly categorized me as the unremarkable sibling. They offered sympathetic nods to my father, silently agreeing that it must be difficult to raise a child who failed to grasp the importance of leveraging assets. Evelyn stood nearby, arranging a plate of catered crostini. She offered a tight, supportive smile to the executives, validating the humiliation. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to defend my financial literacy or explain the complex risk models I built for a living. Arguing with a man performing for an audience is a poor strategic choice. It only validates the premise of his insult. I simply offered a polite professional smile, shook the hands of the executives, and murmured a generic pleasantry about the beautiful evening. I stepped out from under my father's heavy arm, picked up a small appetizer from a passing waiter, and retreated to the edge of the room. I spent the next hour circulating quietly. I was not there to seek revenge for a lifetime of casual cruelty. Vengeance is an emotional response, and emotions cloud judgment. I was there to execute a final irreversible audit of a toxic ledger. I noted the exact layout of the formal dining room where the catered meal would soon be served. I counted the chairs, assessed the sightlines, and calculated the social blast radius. I mapped the exact trajectory of the fallout. I watched my family members interact with their guests, fully recognizing that this was the final hour of their grand illusion. Richard continued to parade around the unauthorized kitchen, drinking bourbon and accepting compliments on a renovation funded by extortionate personal debt installed in a structure he did not own. He felt invincible, surrounded by the glittering illusion of his own success. He believed he had successfully put me in my place, establishing the hierarchy for all to see. He thought the silence I maintained was a symptom of defeat. He did not realize that silence is also the sound a structural beam makes right before it snaps. The catering staff began directing the guests toward the formal dining room. Small chimes signaled the start of the seated dinner. The guests filtered into the adjacent space, finding their assigned seats marked by heavy cardstock place cards. The lighting was dimmed, creating an atmosphere of exclusive prestige. I found my seat near the far end of the long mahogany table, placed deliberately away from the executives. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the smooth, cold surface of my smartphone resting in my pocket. The stage was set. The audience was seated, and the final accounting was about to begin. The catering staff moved with practiced efficiency, pouring expensive Cabernet Sauvignon and serving plates of pan-seared filet mignon, draped in a rich peppercorn reduction. The formal dining room was a masterclass in performative affluence, meticulously staged to project an image of unshakable solvency. A 12-foot mahogany table occupied the center of the space, illuminated by a heavy crystal chandelier that cast fractured, glittering light across the rented bone china and polished silver. 20 guests took their assigned seats. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive floral arrangements, and the unspoken, relentless calculations of Midwestern corporate networking. I sat near the far end of the table, flanked by a junior vice president of logistics, who spent the first course detailing his recent golf trip to Scottsdale, and an ambitious local alderman seeking campaign donors. I ate my dinner methodically, slicing the meat with measured precision, offering polite nods to my neighbors. The conversation around the room flowed in predictable shallow currents. People discussed market trends, upcoming mergers, the yield curves on municipal bonds, and the perceived virtues of various private schools in the surrounding prestigious zip codes. At the head of the table, my father operated in his element. Richard thrived on a captive audience. He held a silver fork in one hand and a half-empty wine glass in the other, orchestrating the dialogue like a conductor leading a symphony. He laughed loudly at jokes made by his superiors, his head thrown back in theatrical amusement, and offered patronizing, unsolicited advice to the junior staff members seated further down the line. My sister Harper was seated halfway down the left side of the table. She picked at her asparagus, her posture rigidly upright, her knuckles white as she gripped the delicate stem of her glass. To the untrained eye of the visiting executives, she looked like a poised, successful young professional, enjoying her family's hospitality. To a trained risk analyst, she looked like a borrower hours away from receiving a certified default notice. Her adjustable rate mortgages had already reset, detonating the financial time bomb hidden beneath her portfolio. The suffocating reality of her imminent bankruptcy was pressing against her chest like a physical weight. Yet she was forced to sit in this opulent room and maintain the brittle illusion of prosperity. My mother Evelyn sat opposite Harper, beaming with manufactured pride, willfully blind to the financial hemorrhage occurring right in front of her. As the waitstaff began clearing the dinner plates to prepare for the dessert service, sweeping away crumbs with small silver tools, my father decided the moment was ripe for a formal address. He tapped his knife against his crystal water goblet. The sharp, clear ringing sound sliced through the ambient chatter. The conversations around the mahogany table tapered off, heads turning toward the head of the table in polite anticipation. Richard stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket. He raised his wine glass, adopting a tone of solemn gratitude, mixed with blatant, unmistakable self-congratulation. He began by thanking the executives for their attendance, expressing his deep honor at assuming his new role as Senior Director of Regional Operations. He wove a tedious, rehearsed narrative about the value of hard work, strategic vision, and the vital importance of investing in the future. He gestured expansively toward the newly renovated kitchen visible through the widened archway, casually mentioning the imported Italian marble, the custom millwork, and the extensive structural changes as if they were minor weekend projects he had funded with spare pocket change from a lucrative bonus. Then he pivoted his attention to his favored child. He extended his glass toward Harper. He told the room that his entrepreneurial spirit had successfully trickled down to the next generation. He praised her business acumen, painting a fictional glowing portrait of a savvy investor conquering the regional housing market. He called her a visionary. He labeled her the absolute future of Chicago real estate. He instructed the junior executives at the table to take notes on her aggressive acquisition strategy, claiming she possessed a rare instinct for identifying lucrative assets. Harper offered a tight, agonizing smile. Her eyes darted toward me for a fraction of a second, reflecting sheer, unadulterated panic. She knew I had seen her balance sheets. She knew I understood the catastrophic debt-to-income ratio she was currently hiding from the world. She raised her glass to acknowledge the toast, her hand trembling slightly, silently, praying the topic would shift away from her crumbling empire. But a man like Richard never stops while he has momentum. He requires a contrast to make his success shine brighter. He needs a scapegoat to elevate his golden child to even higher pedestals. Emboldened by the heavy Cabernet and the polite applause from his colleagues, he turned his sights directly on me. The smile on his face shifted from jovial to predatory. The performative warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer that I recognized from a lifetime of quiet belittlement. "And then we have Mabel," Richard said, his voice projecting clearly across the length of the dining room. The guests shifted their gaze toward my end of the table. The junior vice president beside me paused mid-sip, his wine glass hovering inches from his mouth. "Still renting Mabel?" my father asked. The question hung in the air, dripping with manufactured toxic pity. He did not wait for an answer. He looked around the room, making sure every executive was paying attention to his carefully crafted punchline. "Your sister owns 3 houses before her 30th birthday. She is building a legacy. Meanwhile, you are still throwing a substantial portion of your salary down a hole every single month to pay off someone else's mortgage. Honestly, you are the real disgrace of this family." Evelyn nodded in firm agreement from across the table, offering a theatrical sigh of maternal disappointment, reinforcing the narrative that I was a hopeless, stagnant burden. The table fell dead silent. The polite smiles vanished from the faces of the corporate guests. The tension in the room spiked, becoming heavy and suffocating. This was no longer light-hearted family banter. It was a public execution. The guests stared at their empty plates or focused intently on their water glasses, profoundly uncomfortable, trapped in the crossfire of a toxic household dynamic. They expected me to flush with humiliation. They waited for me to lower my head, offer a defensive stammer, or excuse myself from the table in tears. I felt no urge to cry. I felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of a system reaching its absolute breaking point. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my financial choices or attempt to explain the fundamental principles of liquidity to a room full of people who measured human worth by property deeds and zip codes. I simply shifted my posture, leaning slightly forward in my chair. I reached into the pocket of my charcoal dress and retrieved my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face with a faint clinical blue glow. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of anxiety. I tapped the icon for my secure property management portal. The application loaded instantly, verifying my biometric credentials. I navigated to the specific digital folder labeled Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. I bypassed the routine maintenance requests and the automated payment logs, accessing the core legal documents stored in the encrypted cloud. First, I opened the master deed for the property, the notarized county record proving the transfer of ownership from the originating lender directly to my anonymous limited liability company. I verified the parcel number matched the physical address of the house we were currently occupying. Next, I opened the active residential lease agreement. I scrolled past the standard habitability clauses and the strict prohibitions against unauthorized structural modifications. I stopped on the final page, centering the digital display on the unmistakable, sprawling signature my father had provided when he unknowingly signed away his autonomy to avoid a sheriff auction. I held the phone in my right hand. The dining room remained paralyzed in an agonizing silence, watching my methodical, quiet actions. I did not look at the executives. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes locked on the man standing at the head of the table. I reached across the white linen tablecloth. I slid the phone screen facing down across the polished mahogany surface until it came to a rest exactly half an inch from the base of his crystal wineglass. I looked at him. The arrogant sneer was still plastered across his face, though a faint flicker of confusion was beginning to register behind his eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping it of all malice, and matching the sterile, unyielding tone of an underwriter issuing a final denial on a defaulted loan. "You should check with your landlord before you knock down load-bearing walls, Richard," I said quietly. My father stared at the sleek black rectangle resting next to his wineglass. For a fraction of a second, his brain struggled to process the disruption. He had engineered this evening to run on a precise script, and I had just introduced an unapproved prop. He scoffed, a short, breathy sound meant to convey dismissive amusement to the executives watching him. He reached out and picked up the device. I watched the muscles in his face. I track data for a living, and the human face under extreme, catastrophic stress provides a wealth of information. At first, his eyes scanned the top of the illuminated screen. He read the header: Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. The name meant nothing to him yet. It was just the faceless corporate entity he had been battling for months. Then his gaze dropped to the second section of the digital document, the corporate registration details. His eyes tracked left to right, parsing the legal text. sole managing member Mabel Blake. The transformation was not instantaneous. It moved through him like a slow-acting poison. The robust, flushed complexion fueled by expensive wine and arrogance began to recede. A sickly, grayish pallor crept up his neck and settled into his cheeks. He swallowed hard. The prominent Adam's apple in his throat bobbed. He scrolled down with a trembling thumb, revealing the scanned copy of the residential lease agreement. He saw the property address. He saw the monthly rental amount. He saw his own sprawling, looping signature at the bottom of the page, the ink binding him to the terms he had just violated by $60,000. The silence in the dining room transformed from polite anticipation to a suffocating vacuum. The ambient noise of clinking silverware ceased entirely. The junior vice president beside me slowly lowered his hands to his lap. The local alderman stared intently at a spot on the tablecloth, recognizing the distinct radioactive glow of a scandal. My father stood at the head of the table, clutching the phone as if it might electrocute him. His jaw worked silently. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords refused to engage. He looked like a man who had stepped off a curb and realized too late that a freight train was barreling toward him. Harper could not tolerate the suspension of normalcy. Her entire existence relied on forward momentum and constant performance. Seeing our father paralyzed, stripped of his usual bluster, triggered her deeply ingrained panic. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She marched the length of the table, her silk blouse rustling. She reached out and snatched the phone directly from his limp fingers. Harper is not an actuary, but she understands the basic mechanics of real estate contracts. She understands deeds. She understands landlords. She stared at the screen, her eyes widening. I watched her mental calculus adjust in real time. For 28 years, she had rested comfortably on the assumption that she was the financial pinnacle of our family. She had built her identity on the belief that I was a stagnant renting failure who lacked the courage to acquire assets. Now, looking at a legally binding document proving that the quiet sister sitting in the corner owned the ground beneath their feet, her worldview shattered. She read the subsidized rental amount. She knew what comparable 5-bedroom estates leased for in this zip code. She realized I had been keeping them afloat. Harper gasped, a sharp intake of air that echoed in the quiet room. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She dropped the phone onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy final thud, sliding a few inches before coming to rest near a silver butter dish. She backed away from the table, staring at me with a mixture of profound horror and bewildered betrayal. She retreated to her chair, collapsing into the upholstered seat, burying her face in her hands. The golden child recognized the king had no clothes, and the castle belonged to the peasant. Richard finally found his voice. It was a weak, thin imitation of his usual booming baritone. He attempted to deploy his favorite defense mechanism. He tried to spin the revelation into a joke. He forced a laugh, a dry barking sound that fooled no one. "Well," he croaked, looking around the table at his frozen colleagues. Mabel always had a dark sense of humor, forging legal documents for a prank. That is taking sibling rivalry a bit too far, would you not agree? He looked at the executives, silently pleading for validation. He wanted them to chuckle to agree that this was a bizarre, tasteless joke. None of them obliged. Corporate leaders possess a predatory instinct for weakness. They recognized the cold sweat on his forehead. They saw Harper weeping quietly into her napkin. They understood that the elaborate dinner party was a hollow stage, and the host was drowning in his own hubris. The junior vice president picked up his cloth napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside his plate, the universal signal of a guest preparing to flee a burning building. I did not let the delusion linger. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my charcoal dress. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to command the room. I possessed the facts, and facts do not require volume. "It is not a prank, Richard," I said. My voice carried a calm conversational cadence, filling the quiet dining room. I purchased this property out of pre-foreclosure 2 years ago. You were 120 days past due on your balloon payment. The bank was preparing to schedule a sheriff auction. I bought the distressed debt through my limited liability company to prevent you from being evicted." My mother, Evelyn, let out a small, strangled whimper. She pressed her hand against her mouth, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The illusion she had spent decades cultivating was dissolving in front of her most important peers. "I subsidized your rent by 40%. I continued maintaining eye contact with my father. "I kept a roof over your head because handing you liquid capital would have been a poor investment. I gave you a safe harbor. In return, you treated the management portal like a concierge service, you berated my staff on recorded phone lines, and you just violated paragraph 8 of your lease agreement by executing a $60,000 unauthorized kitchen remodel using predatory personal debt." I paused, letting the data settle over the room. The 28-year narrative of Mabel Blake, the disappointing, small-minded renter, evaporated into the scent of roasted garlic and fresh paint. I had not just defeated my father in a petty argument. I had systematically audited his entire existence and found him bankrupt in every conceivable metric. I was not the overhead. I was the underwriter. I held his future in my hands, and I had just closed the ledger. The exodus of the corporate guests was swift, silent, and ruthlessly efficient. Corporate survival instincts dictate that an ambitious professional must never remain in the blast radius of a superior's public humiliation. The junior vice president beside me stood up so abruptly, his chair nearly toppled backward against the credenza. He muttered a disjointed, panicked apology about an early morning tea time, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the arched doorway leading to the foyer. The local alderman followed suit, abandoning a half-eaten filet mignon and a full glass of expensive wine. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as the various executives and social climbers scrambled to retrieve their coats from the front closet. Nobody offered to help clear the plates. Nobody lingered to exchange pleasantries or offer comfort to the host. The hired caterers, sensing the volatile shift in the atmosphere and recognizing a family dispute that would likely end without a tip, quietly retreated down the service hallway, abandoning their stations. Within 4 agonizing minutes, the heavy front door clicked shut for the final time. The grand dining room, previously humming with manufactured prestige, and the clink of crystal felt like a hollowed-out cavern. I remained standing at the far end of the long table. Richard stared at the empty chairs. The elite audience he had spent a fortune to assemble had abandoned him, leaving only the family members he deeply despised. Stripped of his spectators, the shock paralyzing his facial muscles melted away. It was rapidly replaced by a feral cornered fury. He slammed both fists onto the mahogany surface, causing the remaining wine glasses to rattle dangerously against the porcelain plates. He marched toward me, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, his face contorted into a mask of pure malice. He yelled that I was a deceitful, manipulative sociopath. He accused me of orchestrating a malicious ambush deliberately designed to ruin his career and destroy his reputation in the neighborhood. He paced the length of the room, kicking a stray chair out of his path, demanding to know how I could humiliate him in front of his new regional directors. I did not step back. I watched his rage burn hot and fast, recognizing it for what it truly was. It was the frantic flailing of a drowning man who had just realized the lifeboat belonged to the very person he had tried to drown. When his shouting failed to elicit a single flinch from me, his survival instinct kicked in, forcing a frantic pivot. He attempted to transition from aggression to negotiation. However, decades of unchecked arrogance prevented him from offering a genuine compromise. He simply could not fathom a reality where his quiet rented apartment daughter maintained the upper hand. He ran a trembling hand over his flushed face, straightening his tie, as if preparing for a hostile boardroom merger. He demanded that I transfer the property title immediately. He did not ask for the deed to be placed in his name. His battered credit history would never survive the transfer process. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger toward the opposite end of the room. He ordered me to sign the deed over to Harper. He claimed she possessed the necessary market acumen to manage the asset properly, arguing that keeping the property in the portfolio of a proven real estate professional would benefit the entire family's legacy. He spun a desperate narrative suggesting that if Harper held the deed, she could leverage the equity to save her other properties, effectively rescuing the entire bloodline from ruin. The sheer audacity of the request highlighted the profound depth of their collective delusion. I looked at Harper. She remained slumped in her upholstered chair, staring blankly at the imported marble installed in the adjacent kitchen. She knew the truth, even if our father stubbornly refused to acknowledge it. I turned my attention back to Richard. I applied pure actuarial detachment, breaking down the mathematics of their existence with surgical precision. I kept my voice flat, stripping away any lingering familial sentiment. I informed him that transferring the deed to Harper was financially impossible. I listed her catastrophic debt-to-income ratio, noting that her adjustable-rate mortgages had already reset across all 3 of her suburban properties, rendering her fundamentally insolvent. I pointed out that a municipal bank would seize this house the moment her name appeared on the title to satisfy her impending bankruptcy proceedings. She was not a real estate professional. She was a liability waiting for a court date. Handing her a subsidized asset would be the equivalent of throwing a brick to a swimmer struggling to stay afloat. Then I addressed his specific liabilities. I reminded him that he was currently drowning in an exorbitant, unsecured personal loan he had taken out to fund the unauthorized kitchen renovation. He had financed custom white cabinetry and smart home lighting on land he did not legally own. By doing so, he had violated a binding lease agreement that carried severe financial penalties. I spelled out the undeniable reality of their situation. They possessed 0 leverage. They had no equity, no savings, and no legal standing. They were tenants who had defaulted on their moral and contractual obligations. They had constructed a monument to their own egos, using funds they could not repay, directly insulting the silent owner who held their fate. Evelyn shattered the tense silence that followed my assessment. She employed the final tactic available to a cornered enabler. She began to weep. These were not tears of genuine sorrow or remorse. They were manipulative, theatrical sobs designed to weaponize guilt. She stood up, clutching a linen napkin to her chest, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks. She asked how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own blood. She wailed about the sacrifices they had supposedly made to provide a beautiful suburban life for us, twisting the narrative to paint themselves as loving victims of a callous, ungrateful child. She begged me to remember that we were a family relying on the very concept they had excluded me from for 28 years. She reached across the table, attempting to grab my wrist to force an emotional connection. I stepped back easily, avoiding her grasp. I looked at the woman who had spent decades applauding my erasure. I felt no pity. I felt the cool, clean air of a resolved equation. I replied that I was not cruel. I told her I was a structural support beam they had spent 2 years trying to saw in half. I reached for my purse, slinging the leather strap over my shoulder. I did not take the smartphone resting near Richard's empty wine glass. I left it lying on the mahogany table, the illuminated screen still displaying the legal deed and his signature. It would serve as a glowing, undeniable anchor to their new reality. I turned my back on them and walked toward the foyer, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house, leaving them alone in the wreckage of their own making. The following Monday morning arrived with the sterile, predictable rhythm I craved. I sat at my desk in the Loop, watching the early commuters march across the bridge below my window. The chaotic theater of the weekend was neatly filed away. It was time to process the consequences. I drafted a concise email to the attorney managing Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. The directive was straightforward and devoid of sentiment. We needed to issue an updated addendum to the residential lease agreement currently occupying my fireproof safe. The courier delivered the thick envelope to the faux stone portico shortly after lunchtime. I did not send an immediate notice to vacate. Forcing them onto the street in a sudden dramatic lockout would have allowed them to claim the role of victims. It would have given them a narrative of persecution to sell to their country club acquaintances, positioning me as the villain who stole their home. True accountability requires a much more clinical approach. I instructed my legal counsel to implement an emotional and financial eviction. The paperwork outlined a strict recalibration of their existence. The subsidized rental rate, the generous 40% discount I had quietly provided to keep them afloat for 2 years, was permanently revoked. The monthly obligation was adjusted to reflect the exact unforgiving market rate for a 5-bedroom estate in that specific zip code. Furthermore, we attached severe financial penalties for the unauthorized kitchen remodel. The imported Italian marble, the custom white cabinetry, and the smart home lighting were officially classified as unapproved structural alterations. The updated lease now mandated a hefty monthly surcharge to cover potential liability and future restoration costs. The final clause was the most binding. The arrangement officially transitioned to a strict month-to-month tenancy. If they missed a single payment, if a check bounced due to insufficient funds, or if a deposit was delayed by even 1 calendar day, the grace period would vanish. The physical eviction proceedings would begin instantly. There would be no negotiations, no second chances, and no tearful appeals. They were given a choice to either pay the full astronomical cost of their curated illusion, or pack their bags and surrender the keys to the property manager. My father reacted to the courier delivery precisely as I anticipated. He attempted to deploy his usual tactics of intimidation. He called my personal cell phone 11 times in the span of 2 hours. I had already blocked his number, routing the calls directly to a silent voicemail archive. Denied a direct line to his favorite target, he shifted his focus to the contact listed on the legal notice. He dialed my attorney's office, expecting to bully a junior clerk into submission. He encountered a reinforced firewall. The receptionist routed him to a seasoned paralegal who specialized in tenant disputes. Richard yelled into the receiver. He demanded to speak to the senior partners. He tried to wield his new corporate title as a weapon, threatening litigation and claiming he was a victim of predatory leasing practices. The paralegal listened to his tirade without interrupting, typing calm notes into a digital file. When he finally paused for breath, she informed him that all future communication must be submitted in writing and mailed to a designated post office box. She reminded him that verbal harassment of the legal staff constituted another lease violation. Then she politely terminated the call. He was shouting into a void. The realization that he could no longer charm guilt or intimidate his way out of a consequence slowly paralyzed him. He was trapped in a financial cage of his own design, and the key was held by a daughter he had spent his entire life diminishing. While Richard scrambled to find the capital to cover his newly adjusted rent, the fragile ecosystem supporting the rest of the bloodline shattered entirely. The timeline of financial ruin is rarely swift. It unfolds in agonizing slow-motion increments before accelerating into a sudden freefall. A few weeks after the dinner party, the central bank interest rate hikes officially swallowed Harper's real estate portfolio. The adjustable mortgages reset, the grace periods expired, and the lenders initiated formal seizure protocols. Banks possess a singular focus. They do not care about social media followings or ambitious vision boards. They care about liquidity. Harper could not produce the required capital. The institutions seized the Lincoln Park condo, the Western townhome, and the Southern duplex in rapid succession. She lost everything she had built her identity upon. Stripped of her assets, she was forced to pack her designer bags and retreat to the only shelter available. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, bringing her catastrophic credit score under the same roof where our father was struggling to pay a punitive market rate rent. The tension inside those walls must have been suffocating. In the Chicago suburbs, public records function as the ultimate social currency. Municipal foreclosures are published in the county registry, a database frequently monitored by local real estate brokers, title agents, and nosy neighbors. The gossip spread through our hometown with the efficiency of a wildfire. The same people who had attended my parents' holiday gatherings, drinking their wine and admiring their leased vehicles, now gathered in country club locker rooms and upscale coffee shops to dissect their downfall. The whispers stripped away the family prestige layer by layer. The neighbors learned that the golden child, the supposed real estate visionary, was bankrupt. They connected the dots, realizing the sudden quiet withdrawal of my parents from the country club's social calendar was not a choice, but a mandated austerity measure. The illusion of elite status evaporated, leaving behind the stark, humiliating reality of insolvency. My mother, Evelyn, bore the brunt of the social exile. For decades, she had curated a flawless public image, volunteering at the right charity galas and hosting the right neighborhood associations. Now she navigated the local grocery store aisles with her head down, desperately trying to avoid eye contact with women who used to seek her approval. She could not invite her friends over for coffee, terrified they would notice the palpable anxiety radiating from her husband or the depressed presence of her bankrupt daughter pacing the upstairs hallway. She became a prisoner in a house she did not own, isolated by the very social hierarchy she had worshipped. I monitored the fallout from my apartment, feeling a profound sense of detachment. I did not engineer their destruction. I did not plant a bomb in their foundation. I simply removed the artificial safety net I had quietly woven beneath them. They fell under the weight of their own gravitational debt. For 28 years, my father had utilized a very specific metric to measure human worth. He measured people by their square footage, their job titles, and their proximity to power. He taught Harper to wield that same metric, encouraging her to acquire assets she could not afford, simply to project an image of superiority. He used that standard to beat me down, mocking my practical choices and my quiet existence because they failed to align with his definition of success. That measuring stick was now snapped in half. The metric had failed them. The pursuit of conspicuous consumption had not elevated them. It had enslaved them to creditors and fractured their dignity. They had sacrificed their familial bonds to impress strangers, and when the money vanished, the strangers disappeared. I poured myself a cup of tea, watching the evening traffic snake along Lakeshore Drive. The heavy burden I had carried for 2 years, the suffocating secret of the deed and the subsidized rent, was gone. The ledger was balanced. The liabilities were contained. I was no longer the operational overhead expected to absorb the cost of their vanity. I was just a woman living in a city, building a life on a foundation of verifiable facts rather than precarious fiction. The only remaining task was to embrace the quiet peace that follows a resolved equation, a silence that my family would never learn how to endure. The transition into winter brought a quiet, settling frost over the city of Chicago. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment in Lincoln Park, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. The morning sun reflected off the frigid, steel-gray surface of Lake Michigan. The glass felt cold against my fingertips, but the interior of my living space was warm, functional, and secure. I looked around the rooms. There were no imported marble countertops or custom millwork archways installed to impress visiting executives. The furniture was comfortable and practical. The artwork on the walls held personal meaning rather than appraised auction value. I did not own the bricks, the plumbing, or the roof above my head. I paid rent on the first day of every month, transferring funds from an account that held a balance large enough to purchase the entire building if I ever desired. I possessed the ultimate luxury, which is the absence of leverage. Growing up in the affluent Illinois suburbs, I was conditioned to believe that physical property was the only valid measure of a human life. The culture of my childhood operated on a rigid, unspoken hierarchy. A person earned respect by acquiring substantial debt and exchanging it for visible square footage. Families destroyed their internal bonds trying to climb a corporate ladder resting on a foundation of quicksand. They equated personal success with the brand of vehicle parked in the driveway and the zip code printed on their return address labels. They spent their entire lives servicing interest payments, trapped in a relentless cycle of performative wealth, terrified that a single missed paycheck would expose the hollow core of their existence. My father dedicated his best years to chasing that illusion. He sacrificed his dignity, his integrity, and his relationship with his children to maintain a facade that crumbled the moment the market shifted. He believed that owning a sprawling estate made him a king, failing to realize that toxic financial instruments had turned him into a prisoner. My grandfather Silas understood the trap. He knew that true freedom is silent liquid, and unencumbered by the opinions of neighbors you secretly despise. Silas recognized that wealth is not what you show the world. Wealth is the quiet option to walk away from a bad deal. I walked away from his window and sat down at my desk to begin my workday. I continue my career as an actuary with a renewed sense of purpose. I log into the secure servers, pulling down complex datasets from regional housing markets, mortality tables, and corporate liability portfolios. I spend my hours analyzing risk, isolating dangerous variables, and forecasting the inevitable collapse of poorly structured systems. The world is chaotic, driven by ego, fear, and irrational human behavior. But mathematics provides a sanctuary of pure truth. Numbers do not lie to protect your feelings. Data does not care about your social standing or your bruised pride. A spreadsheet offers a clear, unfiltered lens through which to view reality. By stripping away the emotional noise, I can navigate life with precision and safety. I apply this exact same methodology to my family dynamics. I no longer waste energy trying to decipher my parents' manipulative tactics or seeking validation they are incapable of providing. I simply review the ledger, maintain the boundaries, and proceed accordingly. Late that afternoon, I walked down to the lobby of my building to check the mail. Tucked between a stack of utility bills and professional journals was a stiff white envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. The blocky, forceful script belonged to Richard. He had bypassed the digital property management portal, opting instead to mail a physical letter directly to the registered post office box of Midwest Risk Mitigation Partners. The forwarding service had routed the correspondence to my apartment. I carried the envelope upstairs, opened it with a silver letter opener, and unfolded the heavy cardstock. The message was devoid of any familial greeting. It read like a formal grievance filed by a hostile litigant. Richard complained bitterly about a plumbing issue in the primary bathroom of the suburban house. He claimed the water pressure in the shower had dropped significantly, framing the minor inconvenience as a catastrophic failure of property management. He used demanding authoritative language, insisting that the management company dispatch a premium contractor immediately to rectify the situation at no cost to the tenant. The tone was remarkably consistent with the man who used to berate me at the dinner table. He was still trying to exert control, still trying to bully a faceless entity into submission, refusing to acknowledge the reality of his diminished position. I read the letter twice, feeling a profound sense of detachment. A year ago, a demanding message from my father would have triggered a spike of anxiety and a deep, exhausting sense of obligation. Now it elicited nothing more than a mild administrative reflex. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the urge to call him and demand respect. He was no longer a towering, terrifying patriarch capable of dictating my worth. He was simply an occupant residing in an asset I controlled. I sat down at my laptop and accessed the administrative dashboard for my limited liability company. I opened his specific tenant file. I logged the date and the contents of his physical letter into the digital maintenance queue. I did not reply to his personal correspondence. Instead, I generated a standard automated work order. I selected a reliable, reasonably priced local plumbing contractor from our approved vendor list and dispatched them to the suburban address. I then navigated to the financial ledger section of his profile. The lease agreement he signed clearly stipulated that any maintenance required due to tenant negligence or unauthorized renovations would be billed directly to the occupant. The primary bathroom plumbing was tied directly into the water lines he had altered during his disastrous kitchen remodel. I applied a pending charge to his monthly account, attaching a formal note stating that the final invoice from the plumbing contractor would be added to his next rent statement. I clicked Save, closing the browser window. The entire process took less than 4 minutes. I treated him exactly as he had always treated me. I processed his demand as a cold numerical transaction. He was a liability on a spreadsheet managed efficiently and without a single trace of emotion. I picked up his handwritten letter, dropped it into the shredder resting beside my desk, and listened to the sharp mechanical hum as the steel blades reduced his arrogant demands to illegible strips of waste paper. The transition from scapegoat to underwriter is not an easy journey. It requires you to mourn the family you deserved and accept the family you were actually given. It demands a rigorous, painful audit of your own life, forcing you to identify the toxic contracts you have unknowingly signed. For 28 years, I allowed my parents to dictate the terms of my existence. I allowed them to convince me that my quiet, pragmatic nature was a character flaw, and that my refusal to chase their hollow status symbols made me a failure. I sat at their tables, absorbed their insults, and believed I had to earn my place in their world. I learned the hard way that you cannot win a game designed by people who constantly rewrite the rules to ensure your defeat. You cannot achieve solvency by investing your emotional capital into a bankrupt relationship. The only way to survive a system built on manipulation and performative pride is to stop seeking validation from the architects of your misery. True freedom does not come from winning an argument at a dinner party. It comes from the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you hold the deed to your own life. You have the power to evict the voices that tell you you are not enough. You have the authority to set the rental rate for your time, your energy, and your love. If you are listening to this story and recognizing the patterns of your own life, I want you to internalize one critical lesson. Stop waiting for the people who diminish you to suddenly recognize your value. Stop twisting yourself into knots trying to satisfy an audience that wants you to fail. Do not waste another day trying to earn a seat at a table built on lies and fragile egos. Walk away from the table entirely. Save your capital, protect your peace, and when you are finally ready, just buy the building.
We spend our lives driving through the manicured neighborhoods of the American Midwest, admiring the pristine brick facades and the perfectly edged lawns. We are conditioned to equate a prestigious zip code with safety, assuming the families residing beneath those vaulted ceilings have solved the complex equation of happiness. But if you strip away the siding and examine the foundation, you frequently find a structure resting entirely on the fragile mechanics of human ego. The story of the rented house and the secret landlord is not merely a tale of financial retribution. It is a mirror held up to a specific kind of modern tragedy, reflecting the dangerous currents of ignorance and pride. It forces us to examine what happens when parents substitute square footage for actual affection, wrapping their deep-seated insecurities in toxic debt and calling it the American dream. In communities defined by corporate ladders and country club dues, human value is often reduced to a numerical output. A child becomes a living, breathing accessory. Parents pour their resources into the offspring, who best reflects their own hunger for prestige, treating love as a conditional investment. The favored daughter is paraded at dinner parties, her risky acquisitions praised as visionary, while the pragmatic child is dismissed as a liability. This is not parenting. It is a transactional exchange fueled by vanity. When you measure your children with a ruler calibrated by neighborhood gossip, you teach them that their worth is tethered to their performance. You demand they carry the crushing weight of your unfulfilled ambition, turning the traditional family structure into a competitive arena rather than a safe harbor. True intelligence does not consist of securing a lower interest rate on a balloon mortgage. It is the quiet capacity to see through the illusion of permanence. There is a profound, almost spiritual clarity in choosing to be the renter. The daughter who refuses to anchor herself to a sprawling estate understands a fundamental truth that escapes her parents. Attaching your identity to concrete blocks and imported marble only builds a heavier prison. Financial liquidity is a physical manifestation of emotional detachment. When the inevitable market correction arrives, the polite smiles of networking colleagues vanish. The social climbers retreat. The only structure left standing is the one built on stark, unsentimental reality. Freedom is the willingness to let the facade fall. To raise a family with integrity requires dismantling the worldly metrics of success. It demands a deliberate shift away from performative wealth, A healthy home is not one where siblings are pitted against each other in a relentless competition for parental approval. A father's duty is not to leave behind a portfolio of leveraged properties, but to foster an environment where a child is valued for their quiet character rather than their loud acquisitions. Moral parenting requires fairness. It means looking at the quiet daughter in her sensible shoes and recognizing her steady strength instead of punishing her for refusing to participate in the charade. Emotional awareness in raising children means retiring the ruler used to measure one sibling against another. It involves cultivating a space where honesty is prioritized above optics. If a parent makes a catastrophic error, true moral leadership dictates that they own the failure, rather than demanding their offspring co-sign a loan to hide the mistake. You do not demand a child sacrifice their stability to protect your fragile reputation. Fairness is recognizing that affection should never be treated as a transaction dispensed only when a child secures a promotion or a new deed. Parents who exploit familial loyalty to mask their own vanity are not protecting their lineage, they are actively dismantling it. We often confuse courage with the blind pursuit of status. It takes no real strength to finance a luxury kitchen remodel to impress a visiting executive. The true test of character occurs when the artificial ecosystem collapses. When the foreclosure notices arrive and the bank seizes the assets, the instinct is to assign blame to lash out at the one person who refused to join the delusion. Real courage is standing in front of a mirror, acknowledging the financial and emotional bankruptcy and accepting the ruin. It requires bowing your head, admitting that the pursuit of a prestigious address cost you the respect of your own blood, and finding the grace to start over with empty pockets and a clean conscience. The climax of this narrative, the phone placed silently on the dining table, is not an act of malice. It is the inevitable collision between fiction and data. When the truth is finally revealed, the tragedy is not that the parents lost their house. The tragedy is their refusal to face the mirror. Instead of feeling gratitude that their daughter shielded them from homelessness for 2 years, their ego demands they play the victim. They lack the resilience to look at the wreckage of their curated life, admit their profound weakness, and begin the painful work of genuine reform. It takes immense fortitude to let your false image die, and some individuals would rather lose their family than admit the stage was built on sand. We tell these stories because the patterns of deception are universal. If you have ever felt the suffocating pressure of a family that values your output over your existence, you are not alone. Please take a moment to subscribe to Fluffy Revenge and join a community where we dissect the quiet, devastating truths hiding behind closed doors. Leave a comment sharing the moment you realized the ruler your family used to measure you was fundamentally broken. We spend our lives striving to buy the perfect home, convinced that the right combination of bricks and mortar will finally silence the quiet nagging fear that we are not enough. We obsess over the foundation of our properties while ignoring the dry rot spreading through our own character. We acquire assets to mask our ignorance, hoping the glare of a new chandelier will blind the guests to the emptiness underneath. But when the dinner parties end and the guests drive away, you are left sitting in the silence of your own choices. You might hold the keys to a mansion, or you might hold the lease to a modest apartment. The walls around you offer no real protection from the truth. Eventually, you have to ask yourself a terrifying question. When the facade finally crumbles and the ledger is wiped clean, what exactly is left of the person living inside?